Well, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Josh Schimmels, publisher and CEO of the Los Angeles Business Journal. I'm excited to be here today hosting today's Tech Talk on cybersecurity. We all rely heavily on technology, both in our professional and our personal lives. And the last year has seen this reliance increase tenfold as COVID has forced many of us to be working from home. The importance of protecting our data, information, and overall communications has really just never been more important. Today, you're going to hear from our expert panelists as they discuss topics ranging from how to protect your business computer systems, your networks, and data from theft or damage, to guidance on loss prevention and ways to improve business processes. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions during the registration process. We were able to preview them ahead of time and also incorporate them into our conversation today. During the interactive discussion, we're going to be conducting live audience poll questions. So you're going to see these pop up on your screen, which we encourage you to answer and provide responses to. And then we'll go ahead and publish these results online next week. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our sponsors who came together for this discussion. We appreciate your support, your guidance, and everything that you put into this program today. So thank you so much to Greenberg Glusker, Locked In Companies, Miller Kaplan, Nth Generation, and USC Viterbi School of Engineering. I want to thank you for all that you're doing to support this program and, of course, today's community of business. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We've got a great conversation to have, so I want to get right to the meat of the content here. Welcome today's panelists. First off, Jeremy Jackson. He's the Director of Security and Analytics with Nth Generation Computing. David Lamb, Partner and CISO at Miller Kaplan. Dr. Clifford Newman, Director, USC Center for Computer System Security and Associate Professor of Computer Science Practice at USC Viterbi School of Engineering. Tim Toohey, Chair and Partner, Cybersecurity Group and Privacy Group with Greenberg Glusker. And lastly, today's moderator, Timothy Smith, Global Privacy and Cyber Risk Consulting Leader, Vice President with Locked In Companies. Timothy, so great to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I truly appreciate it. And to the panel members and everybody who's joining us from wherever you are joining us. So thank you all. Just quickly who I am and with what my role is and how we're going to deal with this today. So the world has been impacted by what's happened over the past year with the pandemic. And then based on that, never leave a good pandemic go to waste, where the bad actors have truly stalked our organizations, our remote workers, and so forth. So this conversation is going to be addressing not only with what we did last year, but how we continue to move forward proactively to protect ourselves and reducing our overall exposures and such. So with that, I'm going to actually dive right in. And with our first question for our group and panel members, over the last year, we've seen most companies adopt work from home digital strategies. As a cyber professional, on a scale of 1 to 10, how nervous does that make you from a liability and business standpoint? And Drum, if you want to go first, I'll hit you.
Yeah, so needless to say, it's a whole new world out there looking at, endpoint in a whole new perspective. So I would give it an 8. And a couple of things that I was thinking about when I saw this question. So one was data distribution. So, historically, we've been able to put, walls around our technology and our data and our intellectual property. Now it's really opening the doors. We've seen that with, mobile devices, but even more so now with work from home technologies. So the lack of policy, process, and auditability around those data sources, those critical assets that we're dealing with, is concerning to me, needless to say. Also, I have a passion for physical security and penetration testing. And so thinking about, all the insecure networks all this data is traversing these days also is really concerning to me. And then finally, one of the other things that we've been seeing a lot is a lot of our customers as well as prospects are using, non-corporate devices. And so when you're dealing with sensitive assets that are being leveraged by unsecured technologies, that definitely concerns me.
Great, thank you. So you brought up a point there, and actually I'm going to go to David and ask for your feedback on what your thought is and what scale you have concerns on.
For me, it's an 11. I am, you know, a lot of what I talk about are these misconceptions, these things that are just not true. And a lot of times folks, the most frightening thing I've seen is that folks think it's okay to use a personal computer to access corporate resources, and they just don't understand the attack chain. And so, you know, what I love about panels like this is the ability to get out the message to our business leaders about how important it is to understand the risks and apply, you know, appropriate measures to protect yourself.
Great, thank you. Dr. Newman, your thoughts?
So it makes me somewhat nervous. Giving it a number, I'd probably put it at about a 7. But my concerns are very much in line with the other speakers. It really depends on the particular business functions that are now performed at home, and more specifically on which systems are used for those functions. My biggest concern lies when employees just decide transfer data to their home systems and use their home computers and personal computing services, including public cloud, Gmail, Yahoo, etc., to do the same things they did at work. These systems are not managed. What should happen is that the company should furnish systems to their employees and manage those systems themselves, keeping in place the stronger containment boundaries and making sure there is no intermingling of data. Now, this wouldn't be a perfect solution, but it avoids at least the deepest of holes in the containment architecture that are created from this increase in work at home.
Great points, thank you. Tim, your thoughts?
I think it's about an 8. I'm concerned that the working at home is extended so broadly, not just the sort of major companies, but medium-sized to smaller businesses. So not every system has remote access capabilities, such as we're familiar with, such as Citrix and the like. And it also sort of exposes individuals, of course, through the enormous use of email, to phishing exploits, and they may not be as up to date on those as they would be in a corporate environment, and it may not be as easy to sort of supervise them. So I think because of the extent of this working at home, that it causes a problem, in addition to all the reasons that the other panelists have mentioned.
Great, thank you. So Jeremy, I'm going to come back to you. So what are some of the key countermeasures for securing the work from home from your aspect?
Yeah, so a few things in particular. So endpoint is obviously what we're interested in now. You know, we've seen an influx of, you know, through the generations where it was, you know, centralized, distributed, centralized. Now we're back to the distributed model. You know, so endpoint protection is really of most interest. I would say one couple things related to that. So one thing is making sure that your endpoint protection is kind of like next generation. So meaning that we're not dealing with signatures anymore. We're dealing with more like behavioral analytics as far as what those applications and executables are doing. One other thing, not to get too nerdy, but script control is really important. So if you're familiar with things like PowerShell and the like, there's a lot of activity related to living off the land or leveraging basically built-in operating system technologies and manipulating those to a hacker's benefit. So script control, script control and endpoint protection, I would say would be my first. Second would be patch management. We're seeing that both from because devices are not coming onto the LAN and or they're are owned by the customer, that patch management has seemed to be a big issue. So definitely getting your arms around patch management. And then visibility would be one of the other things that I would say is, you know, traditionally we have given corporate assets to entities, employees, customers, or contractors, and the like to touch our technology. Now we're often seeing that they're bringing their own technology, and so it's kind of like a BYOD thing, but many organizations don't really have that well developed. And so there's a lot of risk associated with having untrusted devices touching sensitive data. So visibility around that, I think, is really important as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Those are great points. So David, I'm going to go a little bit further now. So why can't I count on my IT vendor department to tell me how secure I am?
So my esteemed colleague at Miller Kaplan, Stan Stahl, likes to say this quote, attributed to Mark Twain. It's not what you don't know that'll get you. It's what you think is true that just ain't so. And information technology and information security are two completely different disciplines. Information technology, as we were talking about with Dr. Newman earlier, is related to risk assessment and appropriate responses to that risk. And growing up on the IT side, you grow up with a different perspective. How do I make it work? And the answer is that IT is not designed to do that. IT is designed to get it working and keep going, and not to assess the security risk. And so we see in well-intended individuals, we see IT folks who just don't understand the risks that they're facing. They don't understand the risks of not having patch management that Jerome mentioned. These are very significant risks. And so what you need is to have someone who understands what risks you're facing, a separate and independent set of eyes, just like you have a financial audit, and you have to have senior management oversight of your information security, just like you manage any other aspect of your business.
Great. So staying on that topic, Dr. Newman, I have a two-part question for you. First question of that is, why does it seem that systems are less secure today? And then, how do the criminals gain access to our systems, and what are they doing when they do get in?
Okay, thank you. Well, so the technical security mechanisms of our systems are actually stronger today, but it's the environment that makes them more vulnerable. 40 years ago, it was harder for adversaries to access our data because of its physical isolation. Far fewer systems were networked. And to get at our data, adversaries had to gain physical access to the systems that were holding that data. Today, users, customers, they demand instant access to all of their data from wherever they might be and from whatever device they might be using. And when we give them such access, we are just as easily giving that access to anyone that can successfully impersonate that individual. And today, that is just plain too easy to do. The same applies to the access we grant to our employees that are working from home, sort of following up on that earlier discussion that we had. And beyond that, the mere fact that these systems are networked means that the adversary doesn't need to be present, and it is much easier to attack our systems remotely than to obtain physical access to our premises. And what do they do once they're in? They steal our data and sell it to others on the dark web, where others may be able to exploit it for various purposes. Stolen credit card numbers, stolen passwords. They gain access to our systems to use for cryptocurrency mining. They gain access to our systems to install ransomware, and then they extort money out of us in order to get access to our own data. But basically, what has made our systems seemingly more vulnerable is, one, there is now money in it for the adversary. That means more attacks. And two, we've made the data more available, not just to the legitimate users, but ultimately also to the criminals.
Great. So with what your experience is in, what are they doing with that information outside of exploiting it for potential financial gain? Are they doing anything else with that information?
Well, as I just mentioned, sometimes it's stolen on the dark web where, for example, a combination of a username and a password can be used for what are called credential stuffing attacks. You have the same username at maybe a banking site, and if someone hasn't or is using the same password there, guess what? You're now in. And now you might be able to initiate a funds transfer or other kinds of things that are occurring. In other cases, we've got nation states that are just sucking up as much data as they can, whether it's intellectual property or whether it is information about our citizens that they can use in their counterintelligence operations or anything else. You also have, a lot of businesses sort of in that gray area that are simply collecting way too much data, maybe not breaking into our systems, but obtaining it because we didn't read that end user license agreement that said, hey, we're going to collect this information, and it's then used for marketing purposes. But there's a lot of things that are being done, sometimes clearly illegal, sometimes gray area, sometimes you've explicitly given permissions.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the additional information there. Now, from a legal standpoint, Tim, what does the legal requirement for these businesses to have reasonable security mean in practice? What is the liability for not having reasonable security in place?
Well, the reasonable security requirement is one under California law that goes back to the civil code provision that is around since the times of our data breach notification requirements for personal information. So it's important to say that basically, the requirement under California law is that you have reasonable security so that you can prevent the unauthorized access of information. But that is personal information. This has been somewhat increased in recent years by the California Consumer Privacy Act, which expands the definition of personal information. But that reasonable security has a fairly narrow application to what is traditionally considered to be personal information under California law. Now, that doesn't mean that if you don't hold those types of information, you should feel free to do whatever you want. Reasonable security is a standard that really requires a business to look at what kind of information and data that it's holding and what's the sensitivity of it and what's the economic importance of it and what are reasonable means to try to secure that information. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all process. It's a sort of iterative and analytic process that does require that you understand what the vulnerabilities of a particular business are to having that information authorized by individuals who shouldn't be getting it. And that can lead to the kind of consequences that we see here and we'll talk about in ransomware and other bad things that can happen. Now, the legal liability in this is an interesting question. There have been attempts for years for plaintiffs who have been victims of data breaches to try to bring lawsuits against the companies that suffered the data breach. Now, the companies may feel that they're victims, but of course, the individuals whose data has been taken may also feel victimized as well. As part of the California Consumer Privacy Act, there was passed an ability to bring class actions against companies with statutory or damages for each breach, for each incident. And that came into law last year, the 1st of January 2020. And we've seen this year the first attempts of class action lawyers to try to pursue companies like TikTok and Zoom and others for these data breaches. Some of these cases are slowly wending their way through the courts, but there's a concern that liability to companies, not only from those kinds of lawsuits, but become from other lawsuits. There have been other types of problems with this. And there's also the potential that the California Attorney General could come in if there is an egregious case to try to pursue this. And so there are real legal liabilities from this, despite the fact that this is a fairly general open-ended standard.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to stick with the legal for one more minute. David, how is the legal landscape affecting what your clients are asking of you to do?
Well, I think this really, for our practice, we're seeing this in three primary ways. The first one is legal rolls downhill. So we see a lot of clients calling us up and asking us to help them when they get requirements from their upstream clients. The larger the company, the more likely they are to have formal requirements, and then they go to their vendors and they understand the risk of having a vendor who has information to the access to their information. So what happens is that, you know, they say, you have to do these things. And the number one thing we talk about is having these policies and standards to which our clients can work to aspire, right? That they've got policies that set a bar for what they need to do, and they have controls and standards that say, these are the things you need to do to have this level of commercially reasonable practice. The second thing that we see a lot of, and I've had many good talks with Tim about this, is, you know, California Consumer Privacy Act, California Privacy Rights Act. The fact that government is getting more and more involved, and we've seen it across the nation, like with the New York Financial Services Law, is making it very clear that you have to have these practices and you have to understand what the bars are for information security. If you don't have those in place, you don't know what to do. And just like Jeremy was talking about earlier, it's very important to know what controls you put into place for what risks and the size of your business, how appropriate it is. The last thing we see a lot of, which is not exactly legal, but it's close, is PCI. It's the credit card compliance requirement. And this to me is in many ways the most fascinating of all of them, because a large majority of our new clients aren't even aware that if they take a credit card in any way, shape, or form, they must be compliant to those standards, to the payment card industry standards. Even if it's just one credit card, even if it's just online. And the fact is that the exposure on this can be really, really large. And if you've done it right, it doesn't have to take that much to get it right. So this is part of why the education is so important, is that if you know the right thing to do, you can implement those things and get your business on the right track.
Great. Now I want to dive into some of those specifics. Jeremy, so we've heard of many companies being impacted by ransomware. How can we better prepare against ransomware cyber attacks?
Yeah, so I have to say, you know, we've been seeing a tremendous influx, and even within our group. So we have a team that I would say in 2019, we probably triaged 20 or so engagements. In 2020, I would say it probably doubled or tripled that. So yeah, you know, you hear the cliche, if it's not when, it's when. And so to that extent, a couple of things that I would highlight is incident response and incident retainers. So having a quality incident response program so that you're not trying to figure out how to fight the fire in the middle of the firefight is really critical. Equally, we're seeing that a lot of these attacks are attacking not only the production environment, but also the backup environment. So looking at it from a disaster recovery, business continuity, backup technology perspective, I think is critical. I can tell you I've sadly triaged a few customers recently that their backups were also compromised to where they had to rebuild AD and they lost all their intellectual property. So you don't want to be in that situation. So definitely looking at that. One of the other things that we saw and we've responded to is, again, because people just started working remotely, they often had to pull things off of, you know, the big shop shelves and use personal devices without really a quality BYOD program in place. And so understanding the security related to the wireless environments, the patch levels, the operating systems, the types of apps that our end users maybe have on these assets that are now touching our critical sensitive data has been pretty big. So we initially thought about consulting with organizations to spend some time to work with the end users to understand like patch level Wi-Fi configurations, firewall configurations, and the like. We ended up automating that with a tool called RESPA, but definitely recommend looking at those endpoints. And yeah, I would say business continuity, disaster recovery are top of mind. So it's really you at some point you're going to be breached. So it's a matter of mitigating the risk and hopefully sustaining business practices while you recover would be top of mind for me.
All right, thank you.
If I can just chime in on top of what Jeremy just said.
Yes, please.
It's absolutely critical to test your backup systems, because just because you think it works does not mean it works. It's absolutely essential. And the other part, to build on what Jeremy said, is that you have to have systems that protect you against ransomware, because ransomware doesn't just encrypt your live data. Ransomware goes after your stored backups. It's specifically designed to hurt you. So it doesn't do any good if you can get it back. You need to make sure you have a system specifically designed to protect you against ransomware attacks, and that it's configured properly and you've tested it.
Great. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. So Tim, is it legal or even advisable for businesses to pay said ransom?
That's an interesting question that I think a lot of people have different opinions on. I mean, I note on the one hand that some cybersecurity insurance policies even provide the services of what you might call a ransomware negotiator, but that is not in comportment with the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, which said last year that it was not legal to pay ransom because such payments may funnel into adverse foreign interests and other activities contrary to the interests of the United States. And they cited some interesting statistics that ransomware constituted 41% of cyber insurance claims in the first 6 months of 2000, and that the demands increased. However, tell that to a company that is, absolutely desperate to get certain backup information, and you're put as an advisor in a very awkward position. And I think that most of the clients that I've dealt with in this have been able to escape having to pay the ransomware because they got excellent forensic advice afterwards, and they could sort of assess the time what was attacked by the ransomware. But keep in mind that there's an enormous loss of time that I've seen from companies trying to get very hard worked and overworked forensic people in to deal with these attacks, trying to find out whether you have to do a data breach notification. So there's enormous implications from this that are, really increasing and are causing a lot of headaches, both in the legal world and in the forensics world as well.
Well, I concur with that from my world as well. So thank you for that. Now, along the same lines, Dr. Newman, we've heard about Solarwinds, Microsoft Exchange server breaches that affected major businesses and government entities. If they can't keep their systems secure, what hope do we have, and what can we do to protect our systems?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that no system is 100% secure. There will always be a way for a determined adversary to get around your security. And we saw that with SolarWinds. That having been said, your goal really needs to be to make it more difficult for the adversary so that they will move on to a weaker target. Additionally, recognizing that you can't make your system 100% secure, you want to structure your system and your operations in a way that mitigates the impact of the inevitable breach. You'll need to apply industry best practices, and you need, above all, to understand your data and your risks. There is one perfect way, by the way, to prevent an adversary from stealing your data. And that is not to keep the data to begin with. So if you do not need certain pieces of personal information, don't ask for it. And when you no longer need data, get rid of it. If the data isn't frequently needed, move it off your system into a disconnected archival storage, maybe an unplugged hard drive or a thumb drive in a secured physical location. Now, when we look at SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange server breaches, these were nation state actors. Most small businesses are more likely to be up against the opportunistic petty criminals. They, that is the petty criminals, cast their tools widely, seeking to compromise as many systems as possible. And that means that you have a better chance of defending against some of these petty kinds of attacks, rather than the attacks that are targeted to a single organization. Now, if you keep your systems patched, and by the way, I'll note that that was part of the problem with SolarWinds. That is, the supply chain of the patches is what led to the breaches. But generally, if you keep your systems patched, at least for those patches that are from those entities that you trust, and you apply industry best practices, you will thwart most of these, at least, quote, background attacks.
Awesome. So with that, and as we talk about these threats, we need to look at how do we manage those particular threats. So David, what's the biggest management mistake that small and medium businesses make with regard to managing their information security?
So first I have a question for Dr. Newman, and that is, are you and Tim Toohey in collusion on both telling me for data minimization? Because that's all I hear from Tim.
Well, you know, in fact, if you took any of the classes I teach, you'll see that I constantly go back to this issue of minimization. Now, it's not only data minimization. Okay. By the way, there are reasons for data minimization very much from a legal perspective as well, but from a security perspective, certainly the case. But there's also minimization of function, least privilege, which is minimization of privileges, minimization of attack surface.
Amen.
Basically, well, actually, I was going to say it later, but smaller is better.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to call out three specific points on what Dr. Newman said. And we've had really some great successes with our clients with related to Hafnium. First of all, stay on top of those patches. For our clients and our clients' clients who patched within a day or two of getting the warnings of the Microsoft Hafnium attack, they were not attacked, or they were attacked, but they were not vulnerable. So one, stay on top of patching is a really big deal here. Number two, for our clients who follow these industry standards, these commercially reasonable practices, when you change an administrator name to something unknown, we had clients who were attacked and it didn't work because they didn't have the known name needed for this attack. And we had other clients who turned it off because there were no outbound services. These practices work, they're important to follow. And that's why ties right into your question, Tim, and that is the biggest thing, the biggest mistake that we see small and medium businesses make is not managing their information security as they would anything else. What's happened is that managers have come to trust their IT people, and IT people are awesome. I used to be one of them, and they framed this problem as one that IT is solving. And IT doesn't, and in fact, I have an article in the journal this week specifically talking about this. IT is not in a place to solve this, and they don't have, as we talked earlier, the perspective to solve it. For example, IT can't change your culture. If you've got a fear-based culture where someone is going to react to an email from a partner because they're afraid for their job and they send confidential information, IT can't influence that. And secondly, IT is not the subject matter expert. So what you need is leading from the top, having these policies and standards to guide you in accordance with what we've already heard from our experts on this panel. And then you've got this right path. You know the steps. You understand what risks you're going to mitigate in a prioritized order, and you get to the right place.
Great. Thank you. And I need you to come join me for a few conversations with my clients to have you tell them exactly with what I just heard you say again. So Jeremy, from your experience, are there any particular frameworks, security frameworks that you would recommend these companies take into consideration in order to adopt a holistic approach towards their cybersecurity practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So three kind of come to mind. So one of the ones that we do a lot with our virtual CISO or virtual Chief Information Security Officer work is the Critical Information Security, Critical Security Controls, or the CIS-CSC. You may know of them previously. They were the SANS top 20, and then they got moved to the CIS top 20, and now I think they're in like 7.3 Rev or something like that. But long story short, we have used that regulation or that framework pretty extensively for regulated as well as non-regulated entities to really understand their posture compared to their peers, as well as just kind of best practice. One of the other ones that we use quite a bit is the Nist cybersecurity framework. So this is kind of a culmination of several of the Nist regulations or recommendations. So especially for highly regulated entities or organizations that work in a multinational organization, we do a lot with the Nist CSF. And then one of my personal favorites, I wouldn't say we do a ton with it, but I hope to see an uptick in it, is COBIT, or the Control Objectives for IT, which comes out of ISACA, which, as opposed to being merely a risk framework, it looks at more overall IT quality. And so we do some work with that as well. But as far as frameworks in particular, risk in particular, I'd recommend the CIS CSC or the NIST CSF.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, Tim, what do you think the effect will be of the massive government data breach that we talked about in Solarwinds from December timeframe on security requirements? And will this lead to new legislation on the federal level?
Well, it's always risky predicting what's going to happen in Washington, and some of these issues, which wouldn't seem to be political issues, such as, cybersecurity attacks in the United States, became politicized. However, my understanding is that voluntarily, some of the affected companies and the company's knowledge about this came forward to testify before Congress. And strangely enough, there really is no law that requires that on a federal level that anyone comes forward and talks about this type of cybersecurity breach. It doesn't involve personal information, so it's obviously not subject to the state laws. And yet we have a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency that would seem to be absolutely suited for sort of being a clearinghouse. Now, there are concerns that are expressed about having companies come forward and talk about what happened to them in terms of cybersecurity breaches, potential liability. And so, of course, there's been talk about having a liability protection against companies like this. But this would seem to me something that was absolutely common sense, that you should have some sort of an obligation to come forward with these breaches that are not personal information. So even if they do end up getting rid of all of the state notification requirements for personal information, you still have cybersecurity breaches that don't involve personal information, and that if they were to happen in other contexts may not be publicized. So there certainly is discussion about that. This has been discussed before in Congress, that you could have this kind of an obligation to report these sort of breaches, but nothing has happened. So I think that this may shock everyone into acting if there can be a bipartisan consensus on this, which there should be, because it would seem to me security is an issue that really is not a political issue, and yet sometimes it seems like it has become one.
Yep, no, I agree with you there. Thank you. So we know we have issues. We know that they exist. We also know that there are ways to combat these risks that we talked about. Dr. Newman, what are the security skills that we need from our workforce, and what is USC doing to promote development of those skills?
Okay, well, above all, we need to develop a sense of security intuition among our workforce. It's not just about teaching the latest security tools that will defend against last year's attacks. Our security staff and our IT staff and our software developers all need to develop an adversarial mindset that allows them to look at a system and spot the unexpected ways that an adversary may approach an attack. Part of this intuition involves also the concept that was brought up a few questions ago of minimization. That is, less is more. A securable system does less than an unsecurable system. By the way, you'll notice I said securable. There is no system that is secure, but there are some that can be easier to improve the security of. What ultimately we want to do is we want to reduce the attack surface of our system. Now, we have several computer security programs that we offer at USC. Among these is our Master of Science in Cybersecurity Engineering, offered within the data science program of the Viterbi School of Engineering. We also have several dual undergraduate majors and minors, including a major in security operations. And we've been conducting research in computer security since before the internet was the internet. Now, maybe it's more a claim to infamy, by the way, but the first computer virus was also developed at USC. For those that are working in industry already, let me mention that our MS in Cybersecurity Engineering may be taken part-time and online. That is, you will participate in the same lectures remotely as our on-campus students, receiving the same education, conducting the same exercises, taking the same classes and exams, and even working with our on-campus students in group projects. So we've got a lot of offerings there to try to instill this kind of understanding in our security practitioners, but it's also important to understand that many of the classes in this curriculum also go beyond simply the pure security curriculum. So we've got a class in privacy and policy, which, by the way, I think we spend more time talking about the law, and not just the law in the US, international law, law in China, otherwise to understand many of the governance issues around the internet. And it's important to understand all of these if we are going to keep our system secure, because let's face it, our security breaches are international, they cross jurisdictions. So it's important to get a big picture of everything rather than taking a curriculum where you just learn whatever tools are currently out there and deployed and how to use them.
Got it. Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, before we take a few questions, I'd like to ask the panel to give their thoughts on the following. What are the top 1 or 2 concerns that you'd recommend business owners take action on immediately as it pertains to their company's cybersecurity? Jeremy, you're up first, sir.
Oh my, it's hard to lock it down to 2, but I guess the 2 that I would say is addressing the endpoint. So, you know, whether those endpoints are corporate owned or not, you know, having awareness around the quality of those endpoints, and the like. We do a lot of work around that, and I would say, you know, that's definitely a key point for us. You know, I've done penetration testing professionally since '94. And I can tell you, I don't really care if you're the janitor or the president of the company, as long as they get a foothold in your environment, that's what I'm after. And so, you know, addressing those endpoints is critical in my opinion. The other thing is, you know, it's not if, it's when. And so from a disaster recovery, BR, DCP perspective, I think organization's ability to respond to incidents is critical. So like I said, I was hard pressed to put it into 2. So the one other one I would throw in there would be situational awareness. So, you know, I've been doing this since '94, and security moves very quickly. We're at Nth Generation, we're huge proponents of awareness training and educating our customers. So, definitely recommend reaching out to not only the local organizations like ISACA and ISSA and OWASP and the Cloud Security Alliance, but equally, we do a lot of training as well. So would recommend you look out to N Generation for upcoming events.
Okay, thank you. David, your top two.
Well, Tim, this is going to surprise you, but number one is going to be pick a senior executive who is going to be the person responsible and accountable for information security at your firm. Number two is get some expert eyes. Get someone in to help you assess where you are, what your risks are, and what you should do. And if you have that map, and I know I'm still in Dr. Newman's thunder here, but I'll gladly take the prompt from our previous discussions. If you have that map of understanding where you are and where you have to go, you're on the right path. You don't have to do it on your own. You don't have to have all the expertise. You just have to know where to go and what to do next.
Awesome. Dr. Newman.
Okay, so a few points and sort of in order here. First, you really need to perform a risk assessment. You need to make sure you understand the sensitivity of all the data you possess. And you need to develop a containment architecture, that is, decide where in your enterprise each class of data should appear, and deploy the industry best practices that are commensurate with the threats to protect the different protection domains that you justify. That's basically all there is. Now, each of those points has an awful lot within it, but that's at the highest level what you need to do. You need to plan.
Okay. Tim, your thoughts?
Yes, I would take a slightly different approach here, since I'm not a technical person, but a lawyer. But the first I'd say is cybersecurity awareness training among the personnel, because these ransomware doesn't sort of get delivered with a thunderbolt from below. It gets delivered through human beings who click on links and who then do enormous harm. The human element is incredibly important here. And then, Tim, perhaps it would be music to your ears, but the second element I'd say is to consider very seriously getting cybersecurity insurance. The new cybersecurity insurance policies out there from the London market and from others really provide for a broad range of protection against all sorts of activities that involve privacy, security, technology, including helping you in a ransomware attack. And the difference between a client who suffered a ransomware attack who has a good cybersecurity policy and one that does not have a policy at all, or worse, has one that's inadequate, is it can lead to really tragic consequences. So, I mean, they are advisable. They have changed with the times. They deal with a whole broad range of risks, and they deal with all of these nasty human elements that come into it, despite all of the great work that all of my colleagues on the technical side do.
Well, thank you, Tim. I don't need to say anything else on that aspect. So thank you for that. But I am going to actually interject a little bit here too with what Dr. Newman stated, the risk assessment itself. So based on everything I heard, one of the key pieces from our view is also understanding that information flow. What information during that risk assessment that Dr. Newman brought up, understanding what information you have throughout its entire life cycle, which then you can apply the best practices and overlay the security controls to hopefully, again, protect that information adequately, or providing the appropriate recommendation of security controls based on the classification of that information throughout its entire life cycle, to include retention, ultimately to destroying that data when we no longer need it. And then on top of that, from the law aspect, a regulatory map, understanding what impacts your organization has to comply with in order to protect that data in accordance to whatever regulatory requirements you might have as well. If we take all of our solutions, that are our top two from everybody, I think the audience should be able to walk away with a pretty good starting list of what they should be doing moving forward. Now, we do have some time for a couple questions, and I've got one right now for Jeremy and Dr. Newman. How is artificial intelligence being used to protect the business from cyber attacks external and internally?
Yeah, so a couple things related to that. And equally, we've been talking about IT risk, just kind of go back to the previous comments. So we've been talking about IT risk, but there's also corporate risk and strategic risk. So I would try to push people's boundaries and say that you need to not only look at the technology risk, but more in a business context and look at those financial and strategic risks as a whole if you want to be a part of the board, shall we say. But in relation to artificial intelligence, a couple of things that kind of came up in particular. So we're seeing it both on an attack perspective as well as a defense perspective. So we're seeing a lot of the technologies that are looking at data pools, clustering data, trying to identify what is the odd man out, shall we say. Is that fish tank doing something else that other fish tanks aren't, for example, or that video camera? Equally, from an attack perspective, we're seeing that as well, where the adversaries are using artificial intelligence to do open source intelligence, gather information about people, processes, technologies, devices, and use that to construct a unique ruse. So seeing a lot of interesting things there. And the one other area that I've really seen a lot of interesting use cases on is surveillance. So you think about like smart cities, the IoT and OT of the world. We're seeing a lot of artificial intelligence related to consuming that sensory data and making use of it. So very interesting technology. We're seeing especially a lot in camera and optics-based surveillance these days.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Newman, your thoughts?
Yeah, so AI is implicated in a lot of aspects of security and privacy, some of those which were just brought up. Perhaps one of the most direct ways, and one that's been applied for quite a long time, is its use in intrusion detection, basically using clustering, machine learning to detect anomalous activities so that you can better identify the potential attack that is occurring at any point in time. There are a lot of other applications, and in fact, some of those we just heard about sort of on the adversarial side, sort of the hack side. You've got planning algorithms and AI techniques that can be used to gather information about vulnerabilities and piece together a potential attack chain. That is a sequence of activities that an adversary could employ. Now, we talk about that on the attack side. The same thing can be used in red teaming in order to identify those potential vulnerabilities that you then want to plug before the adversary learns about it. So AI definitely is a double-edged sword. Some of the other things that we just heard about really get more into the issue of privacy. That is use of AI technologies and machine learning to infer information that might be private or sensitive, and to use it in ways that might be counter to certain privacy regulations. And in fact, the EU just put in place, or is in the process of putting in place, certain legislation on use of AI technologies in ways that may be biased or otherwise invade privacy of individuals. Now, the last area where artificial intelligence may come into play, in fact, you've started to see some of this, is the whole area of use of AI in developing these, quote, deep fakes, the videos that look just like someone. Now, if you think about phishing attacks we get today, it's an email message and you click on the link, you go to a website and you think, okay, it's the real website when it isn't. Imagine now that it is a deep fake of your boss on a video stream asking you to do something. I think that that's one of the things we're going to start to see in the very near future.
Okay, Thank you. So we have time for one quick question. We're going to do basically a quick fire to Tim and David. So sit back and prepare yourselves quickly. How have California's new privacy laws, the Ccpa and Cpra, affected the security requirements for businesses? Tim, first, please.
In some ways, not very much, except that the definition of privacy or private information is expanded enormously through both of those. And the CCPA did add on a similar reasonable security requirement for the companies that are subject to the CCPA, which is not everyone. So these were primarily, first and foremost, privacy laws, and security was something of an afterthought in them, though it does have an indirect implication.
All right, David?
I'll build on what Tim just said, and that is companies are looking for this commercially reasonable get out of jail card. And the path to that we talk about all the time is having someone in charge managing your information security policies and standards to get to that level. And it is just not that hard if you follow the process. So that's really the most exciting part for me as a practitioner.
Amazing. Thank you, gentlemen. Josh, back to you, sir.
Well, I want to thank all of you. How about a round of applause for today's speakers, Jeremy, David, Dr. Newman, Timothy, and Tim. Just outstanding. I mean, really, this was such an informative and necessary conversation. A lot of the content that was discussed today is also going to be available in the Business Journal on Monday, both digitally and in the print versions. You know, I thought in particular the last group question that was asked, Timothy, you asked to provide one or two concerns of immediate action that business owners and leaders can take. And I love the responses that we got. You know, I think you make a good point. From the four panelists, each given one or two, it's a pretty good blueprint of the next actions that can be taken, from just understanding the need to make cybersecurity a priority in your organization to risk assessments and awareness training. Sometimes, you know, you talk about some of those scams that are out there. A lot of them can be avoided with awareness training with your employees, what not to click, phishing scams, what to look for in the emails, how to identify emails that are probably not real, or requests that probably aren't coming from the CEO. We've all seen them. So I want to thank you all for just an outstanding hour, a lot of great information and content. Additionally, I would remind all of you that this has been recorded. It's going to be available up on our website, labusinessjournal.com. So if there's somebody you'd like to send it to, please take a look at it and go social with us. And, you know, until we see you again with new information on how to stay safe, everybody stay physically safe. And then from a cybersecurity standpoint, keep your company safe as well. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Have a good day.